Hello, everyone, and welcome to Achieving Zero. The learning objectives for this session are shown here, and we'll be following up with a survey and with more information on how to receive AIA credit for this session after the event. We'll also collect questions submitted to the Q&A throughout the session, and if we speakers are not able to get to all of those questions by the end of the session, we'll provide answers in writing, and we'll share those answers on the event website after the teach-in. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the two speakers for this session. Myself, my name is Erin McDade. I'm a Senior Program Director with Architecture 2030, and Angelica Ospina, who is the Technical Director of the Colombia Green Building Council. So I'm going to get us started today by talking about codes and policies for decarbonizing our building sector. And to get us started, I'm going to provide a little bit of context. So when we're looking at cities across the world, the typical GHG emissions trend for a developed city is about 83% of emissions are going to come from existing buildings by the time we reach our climate target of 2040, and only 17% of those emissions will come from new construction. Now, of course, this will vary dramatically if we're talking about brand new cities that are going to be built within the coming decade. But for most of the cities in the North and South American region, the trend will be something along these lines. And when we're talking about decarbonizing, of course, what we're really talking about is how to get the fossil fuels out of our buildings. And so breaking that down a little bit, what does the breakdown of electricity and gas look like for new construction in existing buildings? So on this chart, you can see the solid colors represent gas. And so for both new construction and existing buildings, the typical building stock is about 40% gas-related emissions. And again, this will vary depending on the region, the makeup of a city's building stock, and the cleanness or dirtiness of the electricity grid. But it is somewhere around 40% of emissions are caused by gas. But that picture is going to look very different in the coming decade or two. All of our electricity grids across the globe are decarbonizing, and they're decarbonizing pretty rapidly. And so when we make it to our carbon date of 2040 for zero emissions, if we have done no action within our building stock, either for new construction or for existing buildings, then 100% of the emissions from the building stock will be from gas. So this shows where our focus is really going to need to be when we're talking about decarbonization for our building stock. So starting with new construction, those charts indicated that for most cities, new construction is not the majority of emissions. But within the next few decades, the global building floor area is expected to increase by 2.4 trillion square feet. And to get an idea of what that is, that's really double the current building stock that we're looking at, or essentially building a new New York City, all 5 boroughs, once a month for the next 3 decades. And most of this construction is expected to take place in urban areas. So clearly addressing new construction emissions is going to be critical. And in order to make sure that we have fully addressed these new emissions and decarbonized our new construction building stock, will require 3 specific things everywhere in every city across the globe. So the first thing all of our new construction is going to need is energy efficiency. And this is achievable by making sure that all the buildings we design and build meet the latest model energy codes, such as IECC 2021. And all of these buildings also have to be fully electric. We can't be combusting on-site fossil fuels if we're going to decarbonize. So we have to make sure that our heating and cooking systems, et cetera, are fossil fuel free. And finally, all of the energy demand for these energy efficient, all electric buildings must be generated or procured from carbon-free renewable energy sources. And one way to support that is a zero code renewable energy standard, which I'll talk about in detail in a minute. So in order to support implementing zero carbon new construction across the globe, Architecture 2030 recently launched the Zero Code, which is an internationally applicable building code standard for zero carbon construction. And again, it addresses these emissions from new buildings, which we know will be significant, by requiring that all electric buildings use carbon-free renewable energy, and that all of this carbon-free renewable energy is in addition to the renewable energy that utilities are required to be adding to their grids as we speak. So it's ensuring not only that these buildings come in emissions free, but that we're helping meet increased electricity demands from these electric buildings by adding renewable energy to our grids across the world. And pretty quickly, it's easy to see how to meet the zero code. So as we've covered, you design an all-electric energy efficient building that uses no on-site fossil fuels, meets the latest model energy codes, and then the renewable energy requirements for that building need to be determined. And there are a couple of pathways provided. A prescriptive pathway uses the zero code default renewable energy table, which is provided within the code, or a performance pathway allows for the completion of an energy simulation in order to determine the renewable energy requirements. And then these renewable energy requirements are met either by generating on-site renewable energy, or again, procuring off-site renewable energy from sources that ensure the addition of new renewable energy to the grid. So a lot of those standards like IECC 2021 and others are used in some places, but not in other places potentially. And there are renewable energy standards developed for certain regions, but not others. But again, every single building that we build, new construction, will need to meet these 3 criteria. And there is a lot of momentum across the world to support meeting that. So for energy efficiency, the building sector has been working on this for decades and decades. And we have standards across the world that include very high renewable energy or very high energy efficiency standards to help guide meeting the energy efficiency requirements of the zero code. And electrification is potentially where we're seeing the most exciting momentum in the United States and across the world today. So as most people know, Berkeley, California last year passed a natural gas ban in new buildings, which was the first city in the US to do so. And within the following months, 33 California jurisdictions have passed similar electrification or decarbonization ordinances. And this is only about half of all the jurisdictions in California that are in the process of passing similar ordinances. And even the largest investor-owned utility in California, PG&E, recently came out and said that they fully support all electric buildings and are working on ensuring that the whole state meets those standards. And unsurprisingly, Europe, of course, has already been working on electrification and continues to explore various ways of electrifying the building stock and phasing out fossil fuel heating across the continent. And then finally, as I mentioned, there are renewable energy standards to meet that third piece of the zero carbon construction pie across the world. The European Union has a directive for both on and off-site renewable energy, as does China. And the exciting news is that just recently, within the last couple of months, the Zero Code Renewable Energy Appendix has been passed. And so what happened is that the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, submitted the Zero Code into the IECC, and the IECC passed the Zero Code as submitted to be included in the update, the IECC 2021, that will be available this fall. And this means that starting next month, jurisdictions across the world can adopt renewable energy standards to help meet zero carbon construction. So decarbonizing new buildings is critical, but those charts at the beginning of the presentation showed that for almost every city, the majority of the emissions are actually coming from the existing building stock. So stepping back, big picture, urban environments are responsible for about 75% of all energy consumption and human-produced greenhouse gas emissions, so very important. And within urban environments, the buildings are responsible for the majority of all those emissions. And so we can see here a list of major cities across the world, and the numbers in yellow show how much of the city's total emissions come from the building stock. So where do the emissions come from within the building stock though? We're using Seattle as an example, but this represents a trend that we've seen all across the United States and across the world, which is pretty fascinating. In Seattle, 2.8% of the total buildings in the city, which is a very small percentage of total buildings, are responsible for 45% of total building sector emissions, which means that the remaining almost 200,000 buildings in the city are responsible for the other 55% of sector emissions. And decarbonization policies for those two different subsets of the building sector require very different implementation strategies. So what this means is that a successful decarbonization policy for existing buildings is not one size fits all, but Architecture 2030 has developed a framework for going about figuring out how to create the correct decarbonization policies for the various subsectors of each city's building stock. And it starts with asking a couple of important questions. Who will be affected by the policy? Some examples, we just looked at big and small. It might also mean commercial or residential. It might mean owner occupied or renter occupied. There are plenty of other breakdowns. And then what will the policy require? And the typical pathways for looking at what the policy will require are, again, either prescriptive requirements, which are typically cheaper and easier to implement, but they don't give owners as much choice in what kind of upgrades will be required to decarbonize their building. Or performance requirements, which are essentially the opposite. They give building owners a bunch more choice, but they require more time and are often more expensive because they require pre and post project audits. So each one is more appropriate for various subsectors of a building stock. And finally, when will the policy affect the buildings? And the two considerations for this are usually, will the policy be a date certain policy, meaning it's implemented on a certain date, and on that date, all the buildings that fall under that policy are required to meet it? Or will it be a phased policy that's aligned with intervention points? And I will dive into what intervention points are here in a second, because these are a pretty critical way of creating strong and implementable decarbonization policies. So when we're talking about intervention points, what we're really talking about are planned capital improvement cycles, which typically exist for large buildings, are not super common for small and medium buildings, or point of sale, point of lease, point of renovation, or point of equipment replacement. Essentially, anytime the building is being touched or ownership or occupancy is changing hands. And of course, life safety and resiliency upgrades like seismic retrofits. And the benefit of aligning policy requirements with intervention points is that it significantly reduces the upgrade costs, which is in particular a critical barrier for smaller and residential buildings. It reduces the disruption to occupants. And there are increased financing options associated with aligning with intervention points. Again, a really critical consideration when we're talking about residential buildings or smaller buildings or renter occupied buildings, where the upfront capital costs may be one of the biggest barriers. So there's a lot more detail about why all of these intervention points are so important and what the benefits of each of them are. And that can be found on achieving-0.org. And in fact, a bunch more information about all of this. Really, this is a multi-year project that Architecture 2030 has been working on. Can be found at achieving-0.org, including guidance on how to go about answering those critical questions that I outlined in order to start creating successful frameworks for decarbonizing the building stock in any city across the world.
Thank you, Erin. What a great presentation. As we transition to Angelica, can you please make me host? We lost a translator. It needs to get updated. And Angelica, you can go ahead and get your presentation started. Share your screen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about how in Colombia, I'm Angelica Ospina, Technical Director of Colombia Green Building Council, and I'm going to talk a little bit how we are transitioning from energy efficiency policies to a net zero carbon commitment of the country. So I'm going to talk a little bit how this process has come in the last few years. In 2016, we started working with the BEA project in a program for the country. We started working in Bogota. Bogota is the capital of the country. And we started working in a goal to duplicate energy efficiency rate in 2030. And what we did is to take Colombia developed a resolution in terms of water and energy efficiency. However, there were a lot of difficulties in terms of implementing that resolution. So what we did, starting in Bogota, was to develop an implementation protocol for that resolution based on energy simulation and other different methodologies that I'm going to explain a little bit more. And the other thing that we did was then to replicate the same work that we did for Bogota into different cities with different climate in terms of Cali and Monteria. There are different climate from Bogota. The other thing that we also did in terms of working in this goal was to have different pilot projects. So we work mainly in existing buildings in terms of that pilot project, doing some energy audits, and also to developing guidelines for existing buildings in those cities. And also, other big part of this project was to work in an MRV system for Bogota. And with all this work, we have been working on this project for the past 4 years, and now we're moving from these energy codes that we developed for energy efficiency to a net zero commitment in terms of the country. So now we're working in a new project that is like another phase of the past project, and here we have like the goal of achieving zero carbon new buildings by 2030 and existing buildings by 2050. And in this new project, and what we are doing now is to work at the national level and also at the local level, and also working in a national MRV platform. In terms of that national strategy, what we are working now is with the different ministries of the country, and something that is very exciting about this project is that we have gotten the commitment from the Ministry of Environment, also from the Ministry of Housing, the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Industry, and also from the Department of National Planning. And like all this group is working together on developing that roadmaps and commitments to decarbonization of the building sector in the country. Then in terms of the local cities, we are starting working at this point with Bogota, and we are still deciding the other city that we're also going to work with, but to develop like subnational strategies for zero carbon buildings. And something very exciting also is to work in a national MRV platform, because what we learned from this past project is also the importance of monitoring and also of communicating how the different policies um, really have an impact or not in our country. So what I'm going to now is to tell you a little bit of the results that we got from that first phase. This second part, we are just starting at this point, but I think it's great that we already have the commitment of the country and that we already have started working on these roadmaps. So in terms of the energy, oh, sorry. In terms of the energy code development, that was one of the huge parts of that project. We really worked with the different stakeholders, and as I told you, we started working at the local level in Bogota, and then we replicated the same work in the other cities of the country. So we brought together national and local governments, also energy utilities companies. Something very important was also to include the developers, designers, and different professionals, also suppliers, manufacturers, and also the financial services, because all these are very important in order to develop this code and in order to make possible the implementation of the codes. And what we came up at the end of this process was with an implementation protocol for that national resolution. For that, 3 different resolutions were published last year, one in Bogota, one in Cali, and one in Monteria. So it's very important that also this code became part of that local policy in terms of energy efficiency. And in that protocol, we have two different methods. We have one performance method and one prescriptive method. And this is all for new buildings. So in terms of the performance method, we included like a set of calculation procedures to assess water savings in these different buildings. And also we included like all the steps and guidelines to perform energy modelings to assess energy savings on those buildings. And we really are pushing for people to use that performance method because it is based on international standards, and also because it really fosters innovation, creativity, and the integrative design process that we promote at Colombia GVC. But we also have the prescriptive method that gives a list of energy and water efficiency measures for each building type, and it's available for all building types as well. So the projects that prefer to go through that path can use it as well. In terms of the energy savings that these resolutions are asking at this point, we have guidelines and everything for these different sectors, for social housing, no social housing, hospitals, offices, schools, higher education, shopping malls, and hotels. Most of these are mandatory in the cities. In terms of social housing, the requirements are not mandatory at all. And in terms of other residential projects are mandatory just in Bogota, according to resolutions that were issued. And how did we develop these codes, these energy codes for the cities? We use as the main base to develop these codes the ASHRAE 90.1 2016, and we use this, and we build like common practice primary packages for all these different typologies, doing some interviews. Now in Bogota we conducted more than 60 interviews in order to understand that common practice because that was very, very important. And also with different and a whole set of different energy simulation iterations in order to get to very cost efficient like primary packages with energy and water efficiency measurements. And I think that that was very important because for the government in Bogota, like the term to have like very cost efficient measures was very, very important, because we couldn't like increase the cost of of the of the construction uh, in the city. And what we had also at the end was a set of some packages or savings or additional savings that we call like voluntary savings. And those are very important because at this point, for instance, in Bogota, like the different incentives are being created for those additional savings that can be achieved using these different methods. So here I have just some results for some of the uses or of the typologies of buildings that we have. So here you can see, for instance, for offices, like the savings that are being required are 21% and 44% in terms of water, the savings. And here you can see like the additional investment that the developers will have to in order to comply with this code. What we think it's very, very like acceptable, you know, like additional investment percentages. So here is just an example of what we got for hospitals, social housing, middle income housing, where you see that there is a huge room of having like more and more and more savings. And what we think is that these codes have been will have to be updated every 5 years or something like that. This is how this is like a graphical representation that we also did in order to present this to the public. Something very, very important in terms of developing this code was bringing, you know, like different and educating like the public sector and the private sector. So we also conducted several training for targeted to these two different groups. And we also produced a lot of documentation that was easy to understand for the different people in the country. So here is how the protocol works, and we try to make it easy and also understandable by all the different stakeholders. So that was one of the main results that we have, is that now we have in place these energy codes in 3 cities of the country. And the other thing, and the other very interesting thing that we have been working, and that we know that we have to continue working also at the national level, is the development of an information system based on different information that we can get from different sources in order to create an MRV system for the city. This is especially for Bogota. And what we want to do is that if we build and we develop these sustainable construction policies and this energy code, then we want to assess if the effect of those policies, if there is really an effect of those policies, and also to give feedback to all this policy process. So what we did in Bogota was to take the different sources of information. We took the land registry database, also a water usage database and energy usage database, and also the construction permit databases from the whole city. And we did this from 2012 until 2018, and at this point we are updating the system with information from 2019 to get energy consumption and water consumption for the city. And other thing that we're working at this time is also to convert all these metrics that we have at this point in terms of carbon emissions. That's something that we're doing also at this point. And here you can see the system, the information system that we got, and actually like the main results. The system can, you can have information in terms of the different counties of the city, in terms of the whole city, or in terms of the unit planning, the zoning unit planning points of the city. We have information in terms of water, also information in terms of energy. So we think we can get like very important information from the system, and the city can have like very important information also to develop other policies. And also with all this information, we have been able to develop different type of analysis based on also in income per capita, and how this affects or not energy consumption and water consumption. So we can see in these graphs that we have significantly higher energy and water consumption in all the residential units with higher incomes. And also to see, and something that was very important is to see if they were implementing or not like different energy efficiency measures, and if this was helping or not in energy consumption. So I think at the end we came up with a lot of information to able to continue in the process of net zero. I think we have now like the information and technical studies to be able to move to that new commitment that the country has done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angelica. Really appreciate your presentation. We are going to start the question and answer section of we have about 5 more minutes. One simple question that came up was, what about embodied carbon policies? Many of you touched on operational, and that was the point of this session, but I thought, Erin, you could speak about the embodied carbon session coming up next.
Yeah, so Architecture 2030, as well as plenty of other organizations across the globe, have been working hard on embodied carbon policy. We recently participated in a project that came up with somewhere around 50 potential embodied carbon policies that could be implemented by jurisdictions across the world. Some have precedent, some are innovative and exciting, and that will be covered in the session coming up called Cities Lead. So if anyone's interested in that, I certainly encourage you to join that session.
And Angelica, maybe you could just speak for just a moment to know if embodied carbon policies have made their way to South America.
Yes, thank you. In the previous project, in the BA project, we didn't include anything in terms of embodied carbon. However, when we started working and talking about this new zero commitment in the country, like this was one of the main things from the Ministry of Environment. I think they are very aware of that, and especially in a country like Colombia, with our weather and with our energy consumption. Actually, the embodied carbon takes a huge amount of energy from buildings. So that's something that we know and we understand at this point that we have to tackle. And that's why we invited the Ministry of Industry also to be part of this new project, because we're very aware that we need to also develop policies in terms of that, and we don't have any policies at this point.
Thank you, Angelica. We had another question come in for you that asks, is the country thinking of increasing the cost of energy and water on a scale so that the more used, the more expensive it is, given the results in Bogota?
I'm not sure if that's something that is going to happen, and actually that has already happened in specifically in, but I don't foresee that there is going to increase more in terms, especially in Bogota at this time. There is a, you know, like one rate that you pay for a certain amount of water and energy, and if you pass that, then this is an increase on the rate that you pay. So that's something that is already in place in the city.
Thank you, Angelica, for answering that. Another question came up for you, Erin, is where does all the data come from that you presented in the beginning, and the big buildings, small buildings, but also the projections?
Yeah, so we were part of a group of nonprofit organizations and local community organizations who participated in a project called the Zero Cities Project. And we were able to analyze from a building by building level the floor area, use type, energy consumption, and emissions patterns of every single building in really 13 cities across the United States. And we analyzed both the current state and projections out to their carbon goals, which were typically the year 2050. And so that all of that information is where those stats came from. And it's also all available on achievingzero.org. And we were also able then to use all of those analyses and projections to start creating policy roadmaps and showing each of those individual cities how various policies could be implemented and what the impact could be on their sector and helping them get to zero carbon emissions.
Thank you, Erin. One final question, and feel free to either of you can answer this, from John Inman. He asks, who is accurately assessing the ability of our electrical grids to deliver this additional clean electricity safely and reliably? How do we find out the shape the power grid is in where we live in practice? With stories of PG&E in California failing, grid starting many wildfires in California, how do we get the infrastructure repairs and upgrades we need to electrify all these buildings? Before I have you answer, I'd recommend John too, once the recordings are up, to take a listen to the proliferating renewables session that just happened earlier in the day. That might also answer some of these questions. But Erin or Angelica, do you have any responses? We only have 1 minute. I know this is a big question, so.
Yeah, I mean, I can try to tackle it quickly. So partly the utilities themselves in many places are being forced to do that analysis. Many jurisdictions have requirements in place already for utilities to achieve zero carbon emissions in their grids by certain dates. Many utilities have also come out and said that they do not see any problem with the increased capacity from new construction, which is what the Zero Code is getting at. The question is a little bit more complicated when we're talking about existing building electrification. And then certainly there already is and is probably going to have to be increased external accountability on some of these utilities to ensure that not only are they meeting these renewable energy requirements, but they're doing so in a way that has safe and viable infrastructure.
Thank you. Angelica, I'd love to have you respond, but we do have to close the session in order to start the others. So Phil, we can follow up by email if there's questions about how the grid is changing to cleaner in South America and in Colombia specifically that Angelica can answer. But with that, I will need to close the session. We have a short 5-minute break, but please log on to the agenda page at carbon-positive.org to find your next session. I want to thank our wonderful presenters, Angelica and Erin. Thank you so much. It's been a very informative session. And if you have additional questions, please feel free to email carbonpositive.org, info@carbonpositive.org, or architecture2030. Thank you so much.